through a catalog. They fill the shopping cart. And at that point, they initiate a requisition that flows through an automated workflow approval process. So the PO that results would be termed a touchless PO. And really what we're referring to there is kind of a controlled process that doesn't require the touch of a procurement professional. An end user can requisition, have it routed through the appropriate workflow approval chain to the right budget owner to sign off on that requisition and create an approved order. Of course, the next step along this happy path is that PO needs to get transmitted to the suppliers. And in the spirit of touchless and paperless transactions, ideally, that is a fully electronic machine-to-machine PO transmission, so using a protocol like CXML or EDI for standard business document exchange, or through a portal interface. So fully paperless, touchless transactions. Sorry, email doesn't really qualify. Someone still needs to key that in on the buying end, and on the other end, it's rip and read, and that someone is having to rekey that data. So ideally, we're talking about a machine-to-machine transaction. And then at the end of this process, goods are delivered, a goods receipt is completed. Hopefully then an electronic invoice is submitted back to the buying organization, again removing paper from the process. And then a three-way or two-way match is instituted, so an automated matching process, culminating ultimately then with an electronic payment of some sort, either electronic funds transfer through the bank or perhaps the P-card. So this is the happy path, when everything goes according to plan, completely paperless and seamless as we go. But we'll recognize some challenges along the way as well and identify ways to maximize the opportunity for each individual transaction and by pay channel. So first we want to look at the potential and start with reducing that maverick spend. And certainly the strategy here is to maximize as much spend through that catalog purchase process that I just highlighted, that happy path, if you will, as you possibly can. So an interesting word of caution, though, on that regard. Here you see some data actually from the Hackett Group that highlights the top performers. So these are the best of the best, the most mature procure-to-pay organizations have realized only 23% of spend on catalog, slightly higher percentage of their transactions, about 42%. So that says that they still have better than 3/4 of their total indirect spend that's going to go through some process other than a catalog-based purchase. So yes, maximize catalog spend, but recognize that the goal for Procure-to-Pay has to include how do I capture and control all those other categories of indirect spend that are outside of catalogs, and catalogs typically encompass standard products like IT, office supplies, and MRO, but how do I capture services spend and non-standard products that wouldn't be on a catalog? And oh, by the way, for everyone other than the top performers, that's better than 90%, 94% for all others. So maximize catalog spend, step one, but don't ignore the rest because that's the lion's share. So step two here is how do I minimize savings leakage by controlling non-catalog spend? So the catalog is almost by definition a compliant purchase because only approved vendor catalogs and negotiated pricing are loaded in the P2P system in the first place. So it's really locking down the process for those non-catalog requisitions as well. And you can see a wide disparity in the performance here between the top quartile performers and the bottom quartile performers in this Hackett Group data, where those on the lower end are experiencing 6 times higher lost savings due to maverick purchasing, about 10% overall, than the top performers. So that has to be a focus area as well. Step 3, how do you eliminate or reduce no PO invoices? So this really is an area that highlights a complete lack of control, really, because a purchase was made, an invoice shows up, and there was never a PO approved in the first place. So someone's picked up the phone, they've gone down to the corner store and said, send me a bill, whatever it is. This is an area that really has to be addressed to significantly rein in corporate spending through Procure-to-Pay. And you'll note that this is really a high volume of no PO transactions flowing through, even for the best performers. So here again, we've got some of the Hackett benchmarks that indicate that even the top performers have better than 1 in 5, 21% of their total transactions are no PO, and significantly higher for the peer group overall, where it's about 38%. So getting control over catalog spending, non-catalog, and eliminating or reducing no PO invoices. One strategy that's popular, by the way, is a no PO, no pay policy to make it clear to end users that if they didn't get a PO in the first place, that invoice, that when it shows up in accounts payable, will be rejected. So a number of techniques and areas to focus on to reduce and control maverick spending. But beyond maverick spending is the idea of enforcing budget control. So the definition of a compliant purchase, a non-maverick spend, if you will, is simply a purchase that's made from an approved contracted vendor at negotiated prices. However, there's a whole other category of spend which needs to be controlled, which is to make sure that there's budget available for that purchase, whether it's being made from an approved vendor or not. So there's recent Gartner research that looks at the fact that top performing organizations with Procure-to-Pay have been able to ensure that 95% of their time the purchases are made at or under line item level budget. So this goes beyond just setting up a total budget for a cost center, for example, but allocating budgets at specific GL codes or line items, and the best performers are getting 95% compliance, and all others are only about 60%, which says 40%, of course, are X budget or you know, outside of budget purchases. So that indicates a lack of control. And here, this is the ability to actually, through the approval and budget review process, ingrained in the Procure-to-Pay system, this is the ability to either deny or defer spending that doesn't fall within budgetary guidelines. So an important area for budget control there as well. Another potential to look at is how do we get transaction process efficiency? How do we turn these more manual or paper-based processes into fully automated electronic ones? And here we'll look at, again, contrasting performance of world-class organizations with the overall peer group. And it starts with automating the POs in the first place, where the best performers are getting better than 80% of POs are automated, only about 50% for the peer group overall. And there's a cascading or a cumulative impact here, which says that if I automate the PO in the first place, odds are 90% of the time for the best class, that PO won't require rework, where someone has to go through and correct it because I've taken out the potential opportunities for defects, the manual keystrokes and so on, that can lead to a PO that has to be corrected. If the PO goes out the door correctly, it also increases the likelihood that the invoice that comes back is going to match correctly with that purchase order and the goods receipt, if it's a three-way match, on the first pass. So better than 90% for the best performers, first pass invoice match. And if I've accelerated the invoice approval and increased the accuracy of the invoice matching process, it also increases the likelihood that I'll be able to take advantage of early pay discounts and capture those savings as well. And in the final payoff of a more automated and accurate process is better spend visibility at a line item level, where the best performers, the world-class, are almost twice as effective. About 80% can claim line item level visibility according to these Hackett benchmarks. So overall, about 80% or better on PO automation, early payment discounts taken, and line item spend visibility, and 90% or better first pass POs and invoices met. Some other opportunities here in the potential category: faster and more accurate transactions. So having the transaction itself automated is one thing, making sure that it's correctly coded and classified so it's in the right commodity code to enable effective spend analytics, and it's coded to the correct GL account, also to provide that spend visibility and reduce rework from a general accounting standpoint on the back end. So 95% and better, accurately coded and classified transaction is the performance of best in class. The speed element here, cycle time reduction. So from the Gartner research, for example, we see that requisitions and orders, the requisition to order cycle for standard products is as little as a half a day, about 4 hours for the best performers, whereas the average overall is 10 times. It takes 10 times longer, about 5 days in total. So the implication, of course, is the longer that process takes, the less satisfied users are with the efficiency of the process, and the more likely they are to take matters into their own hands and go do a maverick purchase outside of the system. So a faster, more responsive system will drive higher user adoption and satisfaction. And point 3 here is the invoice matching and reconciliation cycle time that on average lasts 30 days, but the best performing organizations that have automated their P2P process, especially the second P, the payment side with the invoicing, can take that invoice approval cycle down to just 5 days, so better than 80% faster. The other implication from a savings standpoint is where you have early payment terms, for instance, 2% 10, net 30, obviously if your invoice approval cycle is 30 days, you don't have a chance to take advantage of 10-day accelerated payment terms, but you will if you can complete that invoice matching and approval cycle in the 5 days you're within the discount period. So a number of implications there as well. So the potential then also includes kind of the byproduct of a more efficient procure-to-pay process is better spend visibility, and that means an accurate, granular level view of the spend data. So from the Gartner report, they've identified that top-performing organizations get about 95% of this spend at a granular line item level. And it's reflected in this chart here where you look at, for instance, from a transaction standpoint, 96% between the commodity at either the 3 or 4 digit class or commodity level. So following a commodity schema like UNSPSC, that's the 3 or 4 digit class and commodity code that gets you to line item. That's much more meaningful than the 1 or 2 digit segment or family level. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about getting line item level visibility. It's down to the class or commodity level. The last piece here really on the potential is generating higher adoption and higher user satisfaction that's going to keep the adoption level where you've targeted. So Gartner here again reports that the leading edge, the best performing organizations have much higher, about 30% higher on average requisition or satisfaction index scores, and lower performing organizations fall at 20% satisfaction levels or lower. And one convenient way to measure user satisfaction, and one that's gaining a lot of popularity in the market, is what's referred to as a net promoter score that's shown here. So simply surveying end users on a scale of 1 to 10 and essentially throwing out the neutral ones that rate you a 7 or 8, and then calculating the delta between net promoters, those that would give you 9s and 10s, and net detractors that would be at 6 or below. Now, I want to talk about the payoff. So those are the value levers. That's the potential. Then what does it produce? How can you quantify the business case, the return on investment from Procure-to-Pay? And I think this calculation is especially useful. It comes from the Hackett Group data as well, where they're looking at an overall procurement ROI and contrasting, once again, world-class performers with the peer group overall. And this is plotted over the last 10 or so years and then forecasted out over the next several. And one of the interesting phenomenon that kind of appears here is the fact that after the financial crisis, if you will, of the 2008 timeframe, it was actually a boon to procurement savings. You can see that the ROI for world-class performers actually spiked during those recessionary years, where they were able to drive significant cost savings and actually at the high watermark generate a procurement return on investment of about 13x. You can see this curve is starting to flatten out for the top performers, but even last year, that was a 9x return on investment, and that's calculated by taking the total spend savings implemented divided by essentially the cost of procurement, labor, benefits, outsourcing, and technology. And I think the takeaway here is that as you look across the business, if you're the CEO, you're the CFO, you'd be hard-pressed to find too many investments that can yield a 9, 10x kind of return on investment. So lots of opportunity, lots of compelling reasons to invest in this area, and lots of ground to make up for everyone other than the top performers, because as of last year, the delta here was about 2 times better ROI overall for the top performers versus the peer group. So to delve a little bit more into how to build the business case, I think it's helpful to start with a series of benchmark numbers to really first establish a baseline and then set some performance targets. So these numbers actually come from the Aberdeen Group benchmarks and look across a number of different metrics, some of the most useful of which are things like procurement contract compliance, because spend under management really looks at sourcing effectiveness. Procurement contract compliance is where the rubber meets the road from a procure-to-pay standpoint. That's the ability to channel demand from the business to those centrally negotiated and a preferred supplier agreements. And you can see a wide disparity of performance here. So the baseline or the benchmarks are plotted across this continuum from the low end, the laggard performers, the average performers in the middle, to the best in class. And the difference from going left to right is really this ROI gap, the potential benefit to be gained from someone moving, let's say, from the laggard category or even from the average category to best in class. And so here in area, on average, procurement contract compliance is only 30%, but achieving best-in-class status would mean getting 78% of that spend compliant with procurement contracts. So that would mean taking almost 50%, just going from average to best-in-class, of spend and making it compliant. And from doing that, average savings that could be delivered are 8% and range up to 12% for the best-in-class. So significant return from putting more of that spend on compliant with procurement contracts. And then there are the various cycle time metrics and transaction cost benefits that yield those process efficiency savings. So these are some of the benchmark data that, or baseline data points that would go into an example pro forma business case. So here I've taken, a hypothetical company with about $300 million to spend at the average performance level of having 30% of that $300 million currently compliant with procurement contracts, targeting performance at 70%, so just below the best in class, and achieving about $10 million in savings as a result, hard dollar savings, additional savings attributable to being able to take early payment discounts, capture higher percentage of rebates through procurement cards, as well as some process efficiencies to be gained in both PO processing and invoice processing that drives up the business case to about $11 million in this case. So sample pro forma of taking either actual baseline data from your organization, or if that data is not readily available, making some assumptions about where you are against the overall benchmarks and targeting an achievable performance level based on what best-in-class organizations have been able to accomplish. So I wanted to close this out then just with a quick vision to what does the to-be process look like. And here the model that we'll use is guided procurement, and the metaphor is a GPS. The same way a GPS can guide us along the path to our destination. In this case, a GPS being a guided procurement system to help end users do the right thing, to drive more compliance spend, to automate the process. And that really means capturing total indirect spend, as I said at the outset, not just catalog purchases, but all purchases through an approved control process. Simplifying the user experience to drive higher adoption levels and higher compliance. Helping to achieve that kind of world-class targeted performance that's going to yield the biggest results from an ROI standpoint. And in the process, generating and leveraging from a sourcing standpoint, accurate line item level spend visibility. So real quickly, what that kind of looks like, first, from an end user standpoint, make it efficient so they can quickly find what they need to find. So here, the model of guided buying implements a category-based search, because if I simply did a keyword search for, in this example, blades, I may be as likely to get cutting tools as I am to get servers or even roller blades. So here, category-based search will drive the user to the appropriate category and therefore yield only relevant search results. Next step, steering the user through the selection process, enabling them to do a side-by-side item comparison of approved contracted products so that they can make an informed choice, the best total cost option that meets their specific requirements. Navigation. This means when I'm going outside of the catalog purchase, how do I make sure that users find the approved vendors and can adequately specify what they need to requisition? So here, a series of guided forms that cover non-catalog categories like temporary labor, like cleaning and janitorial services, and others that are shown here, providing that guidance through the navigation. The guided form then walks the user, actually prompts the user to specify what they want for that non-catalog requisition. So if it's equipment lease, what is the type of material? What is the rental period? Is it a capital and operating lease? All those kinds of questions are prompted to the user in the guided buying model. And ease of use follows all the way through to checkout. So it's not just making it easier for users to fill the shopping cart, it's making it easier for them to check out and complete a compliant purchase that's accurately coded and classified and goes through the right approval chain. So here the key is defaulting all this information, defaulting the commodity code, the GL code, the ship to and bill to information, removing guesswork and keystrokes on the part of the end user. Enforcing budget control, we mentioned it earlier. That means providing visibility both to the requisitioner and the approver as to what is the available budget. To make an informed decision about what I want to purchase, an informed decision as the approver as to whether or not you want to approve that purchase as an on-budget compliant transaction, and then giving the requisitioner visibility to the status of their request as it goes through the approval process throughout. And completing that process then, enabling mobility. So this means end user or approvers that may only be occasional users of the Procure-to-Pay system can view that shopping cart, that requisition, in their mobile device and approve or reject the order without ever having to log in right through their smartphone or handheld device using the mobile functionality. So that gives you a view of kind of what the 2B process looks like, how you can capture all those benefits and get that P2P payoff. Closing out today, just to kind of complete the picture for you, Zycus provides not only Procure-to-Pay, but an entire integrated source-to-pay suite that brings together both it's kind of the yin and yang of procurement and sourcing, the strategic aspects of spend analytics, category management, strategic sourcing, supplier management, and contract management with the transactional activities involved in Procure-to-Pay that we've just reviewed. And did want to remind everyone attending today that upcoming, in the first part of November, November 9th through the 11th, Amelia Island, Florida, Zycus will be hosting our annual Horizon Conference, which is all about sharing this kind of best practice information, establishing networking and best practice sharing opportunities in a very conducive setting, which happens to be the Ritz-Carlton at Amelia Island, and there's a special value for everyone attending today that would like to sign up for that conference. So with that, I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to address any questions that may have come in during the presentation. So Jagriti, I know you've probably been aggregating those. Any questions that I can cover before we sign off today?
Yes, Richard. So there's a question coming up. The first one is, we don't have good data, so establishing our baseline performance is a challenge. What strategies would you suggest for it? Yeah,
it's a good question, and that's the reason, Jagriti, I have made liberal use of as much benchmark data as I can get my hands on. You've seen it sprinkled throughout the presentation. And oftentimes that can be a very good proxy. So, the reason, it's a little bit of a catch-22. The reason companies are putting forth a business case to invest is they lack the systems that would produce reliable data. So, absent that the actual data, oftentimes a good starting point is to sort of pinpoint where you are on a continuum. You kind of know if you're just still dealing with highly manual, paper-bound processes, decentralized purchasing, where you don't have much control. You're probably on the laggard end of that continuum, which, with a glass is half full perspective says that just means lots more opportunity from a business case standpoint to drive savings if you're starting from the lower end of the scale. But oftentimes that's one strategy, is to use the benchmark data and make some assumptions based on that. The other is to do some sampling techniques. You don't have to have all the data, but you could take a sample month, pull some invoices to review those. Were they properly approved? Were they paid to approved vendors or non-approved vendors? And extrapolate from some sampling techniques what the overall situation may be. So those are a couple of strategies that can be very effective there.
We have more questions coming in. The next one is, how do we change user behavior to ensure they're doing the right thing, buying from approved vendors, following the appropriate approval chains, and correctly coding and classifying each purchase?
Yeah, this really is about, there's a big change management component to Procure-to-Pay, and it's especially when you recognize that potentially any employee in the business could be at least an occasional user of Procure-to-Pay. So you really have to focus on ease of use, number one, and that's why I've kind of highlighted this guided buying model. Is changing, the easiest way to change user behavior is make it easy for end users, is to not require them to have some kind of innate knowledge of how to code and classify transactions or who needs to approve it. Don't make them, have to go hunting around to find out who is the approved vendor that I need to buy this from. Guide the user through all those decisions. Default that information as much as possible, because at the point at which you make it easier for end users to comply with the Procure-to-Pay system, do the right thing, that's the disincentive that they need to do something else, which is go out on their own and make a bunch of phone calls or whatever. When they can get that 4-hour turnaround on rec to order, when they can get that kind of a Amazon shopping experience that they're familiar with as consumers, that's going to drive the behavior change.
Okay.
And so, Jagri, I noticed some questions coming in as well about sort of the value proposition to suppliers, which I think is an important one. First of all, the business model matters. So I know in the Zycus business model, it's predicated on no supplier fees of any kind. So removing that barrier to entry right at the outset is key to driving supplier adoption and participation. So there's no cost to the suppliers to participate, there's no transaction fees to receive orders and so on. And there is a value proposition that, a corollary to this on the supplier side, which says, number one, if you're an approved contracted vendor, by our buying organization doing a better job of controlling maverick spend, we're going to increase volume to you. And not only that, by automating the transactions, we're going to make it easier on your side to process those orders, so less costly on your side. Certainly to get, for instance, a CXML PO that goes right into their order entry system instead of, an email attachment that they then have to rip and read and someone has to key in to process the order. All of which should also mean that delivering more volume, more transactional efficiency to your suppliers, lowering their cost to serve, ought to mean ultimately better prices back to you as the buying organization as well. So it does create a win-win.
So since we're talking about supplier adoption, the next question here from an attendee is, what kind of targets should I set for user adoption? What proportion of the employee population is typically enabled?
Yeah, that's really an interesting question because, as I said, and first of all, the caveat that universally applies, of course, is it all depends. And it's what it depends on is what the organizational strategy is, because sometimes it's to maintain some level of centralization and having, requests flow through designated, administrators or buyers to manage that. In that case, the end user footprint is going to be smaller where there's still centralization, but oftentimes the goal is to decentralize the requisitioning and ordering as much as possible of these, what tend to be low-value, high-volume transactions. And, what I would say generally, certainly it's possible that everyone in the business could be either a user or an approver eventually, but typically I think what you're looking at is setting a target of at least 50% or more tends to be the standard. And as you get into the, you probably reach the point of diminishing returns when you get to the 70, 80% of users, but 50% tends to be the yardstick to measure by.
Mm-hmm. So the next question, Richard, is how long can I expect a P2P implementation to take, and how long to achieve payback?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because certainly the initial implementation cycles have been dramatically accelerated with the advent of the software as a service model. So the fact that the software doesn't have to be installed and configured behind the firewall, doesn't consume, therefore, significant internal IT resource. You are talking about an initial implementation that's weeks long instead of months or years. So this is not, what the traditional kind of enterprise software, very long cycle deployment phase. But by the same token, the big bang rollout is not the best practice. So that's the initial implementation to get up and running. Expect to go through multiple waves of onboarding, both internal users and suppliers. That's really an ongoing process. So that user onboarding and supplier onboarding will continue throughout, but the initial implementation can be accomplished in a matter of, oftentimes 12 to 16 weeks, and the initial payback periods will therefore be less than a year.
Great. So the next question is, Richard, where are the hard dollar cost savings in P2P?
Yeah, the hard dollar savings really come from being able to channel more of the existing spending away from non-approved, non-contracted suppliers to your preferred contract. And on average, that moving a maverick purchase to an approved contracted vendor purchase will yield about 8% savings. The other hard dollar component is the ability through the effective budget control to actually deny or defer spending in the first place. Spend purchases that shouldn't happen because there isn't budget available and they shouldn't be approved. So those are the hard dollar benefits.
I see a lot of people asking questions. So we'll just take this last question for today since we are running short on time. Anyone who has any more questions can always mail us. Richard's credentials are also there on the screen. So anyone who wants to mail any questions directly to Richard can do so. Otherwise, you can mail all your queries at webcast@zycus.com. So Richard, the last question for today. Beyond cost savings, what are some of the strategic benefits from P2P?
Yeah, I think that the biggest one from a procurement standpoint is finally getting visibility at that granular level, as I said, the level three-digit, four-digit class and commodity level, to start making sense of these purchase transactions from a strategic sourcing and category management standpoint. So getting reliable data in an area that's been notoriously, inaccurate is one of the big strategic benefits. And also getting better understanding of user behavior. So finding what are the most preferred products, and then therefore focusing on contracting for those items. What are the most preferred vendors that your users search for the most frequently, and concentrating on them from a strategic supplier management standpoint, really starting to get that big data benefit of being able to analyze buying patterns and make strategic decisions as a result.
That was interesting. So with that, we wind up today. Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks a lot, Richard, for presenting this webinar. I hope we all had some new information. Anyone who has any queries can feel free to write back at webcast@zycus.com or contact Richard on the given email ID. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, everyone.